One director called Tarantino's movies a schoolboy's fantasy, the kind he'd be wanking to while his mom made dinner. Another said he owes him money. And Spike Lee? That feud's been ugly for decades. These 5 directors hate Tarantino, and they don't hold back. It's fair to say Tarantino's films can go way over the top with the violence, and yeah, there's some sex in there too. Most of his audience totally digs it, but not everyone's amused. Nick Broomfield, who, by the way, is known for these really influential documentaries digging into political stuff like South African apartheid, doesn't find Tarantino's work funny at all. He literally said, and I'm quoting here, "It's like watching a schoolboy's fantasy of violence and sex, which normally Quentin Tarantino would be wanking alone to in his bedroom while his mother is making his baked beans downstairs." Then he pointed out Tarantino's connection with his go-to producer, saying, only this time he's got Harvey Weinstein behind him and it's on at 1 million screens. Alright, now let's talk about Michael Haneke for a minute. This is another movie auteur who really does not dig Tarantino's love of on-screen violence. Now you'd think a guy who directed Funny Games and Caché might be okay with some pretty dark stuff, because Funny Games is already a rough watch. But apparently he feels Tarantino just takes it way too far, especially with Pulp Fiction back in '94, which is obviously brutal in its physical approach. Haneke once said, "I remember when Quentin Tarantino's Pulp Fiction came out, and I was sitting in a matinee filled with young people. The famous scene of a boy's head being blown off caused a huge commotion in the theater. They thought it was great, and they almost died laughing. I was upset because I think it's irresponsible." So clearly, this Austrian director believes there's a responsibility for filmmakers to show violence in a careful way, something Tarantino definitely isn't on board with. Unlike Michael Haneke, Oliver Stone is a guy who definitely loves and knows his way around on-screen violence. After all, he gave us Natural Born Killers and Platoon. But Stone's really not a Tarantino fan, and it all ties back to Natural Born Killers, starring Woody Harrelson, Juliette Lewis, and Robert Downey Jr. Now, Tarantino wrote the original story for that, but Stone didn't just stick to directing. He made a bunch of changes to the script. That didn't sit well with Tarantino, who actually tried to publish his original version as a paperback, which led to a lawsuit from the producers. Stone fired back, saying Tarantino got paid a lot of money for his work and hadn't even seen the finished movie, but was still saying stuff about my films, calling it all outrageous. Meanwhile, Tarantino basically had the last word here, saying, "I hated that f***ing movie." So there you go. Spike Lee versus Tarantino is one of the nastiest Hollywood feuds ever. Back in the 90s, these two were actually huge fans of each other. I mean, Tarantino was raving about one of Lee's earliest films as a big deal for African-American cinema. And Lee was hyping Tarantino as this really exciting new voice on TV. Tarantino even popped up in one of Lee's movies, playing this smug Hollywood director. But then all that goodwill went flying out the window around 1997, right when Jackie Brown dropped. See, Lee had a major problem with how often the N-word got tossed around. Apparently, it's in there nearly 40 times. He basically said Tarantino was a little too obsessed with using it, like, what does he want to be? An honorary black man? Tarantino shot back, saying he didn't need Lee's blessing, and basically accused Lee of acting like he was in charge of deciding which white directors could tackle black themes. "Spike attacked me to keep his Jesse Jackson of cinema status," he told Playboy. Basically, you needed Spike's blessing if you were white and dealing with black stories. I wasn't asking for it, and he hated that. Things escalated again in 2012 with Django Unchained, which Lee outright refused to watch, calling it disrespectful to the people who lived through the era it depicts. Tarantino responded by saying if Lee wouldn't even see the film, then his criticisms didn't really hold weight. And from there, it just got uglier. This one is kind of tragic, because Tarantino's always been known to be a huge fan of Godard's work. He even named his production company A Band Apart, after the French director's 1964 new wave film, Bande à part. Now here's where it gets nasty. Godard basically came out and said, "I think his work is null." He chose the title of one of my worst films to name his production company. That doesn't surprise me at all. But that's not all. He went even further in another comment, saying, Tarantino named his production company after one of my films. He'd have done better to give me some money. And apparently, he also called Tarantino a facon, which translates to a low or dishonest person. So yeah, one of Tarantino's favorite filmmakers just straight up dissed him. Obviously, that kind of disrespect got under Tarantino's skin, and eventually he turned against Godard. He later said, I'm not really a big fan of him anymore. You get into him for a while and he's like your hero for a little bit. You start drawing shit like him and then you outgrow. But let's be real. That was probably just him trying to save face after getting burned by one of his heroes.